Okay, this one has taken a little while for me to get to, so here we go. Shalom, salam and merhaba everyone. Do you like war? Maybe you'd like some war with your war and perhaps a side serving of civil war. Well, strap one on, Dorothy, you've come to the right place. When looking at human gobshitery, I always try to look at things like an alien who has just arrived from a distant planet. I think of the rather childish but deeply profound question President Reagan asked Premier Gorbachev at the 1985 Geneva summit. What would you do if the United States were suddenly attacked by someone from outer space? Would you help us? Both leaders agreed they would assist each other, and from a question that at first seems retarded, a new understanding was born. So where does it all begin? Is it the rise of ISIS, the fall of Iraq, the Gaza War, the 2005 Lebanon War, the Second Intifada, the First Intifada, the settlements, the Lebanese Civil War, the Iranian Revolution, the expulsion of the PLO from Jordan, the Yom Kippur War, the Six-Day War, the treatment of the Kurds, the Suez Crisis, the Cold War, the Arab-Israeli War, the Holocaust, the British and French mandates, the Ottoman Empire, the Crusades, the rise of Islam, the fall of Rome, the rise of Christianity, the Roman Empire, the Persian Empire, the Assyrian Empire, feudalism, Islamism, Zionism, communism, capitalism, fascism. Who the fuck knows, and more importantly, who the fuck cares? Like all long-running, slow-burning conflicts, it's fueled by myriad factors coupled with long tribalistic memories, probably originating with whose ancestor stole the virginity of whose ancestor's goat. Of course, the scaffold that bolts the conflict together is a series of equally ridiculous, diametrically opposed ethereal claims. By way of analogy, let me tell a very modern story that occurs in university towns across the developed world nearly every September. A group of freshmen looking to rent a house respond to an ad on Craigslist. They meet the old man who owns the house down the dog track and pay a deposit. The next Saturday morning they begin moving in. About an hour or so later, a second group of freshmen arrive and begin unpacking their stuff. A disagreement ensues and the second group claim they paid their deposit to the owner's son, a handsome young Mexican carpenter they met down the knocking shop. He told them he takes care of the old man's property since the old man went a bit gaga and now spends all his time down the dog track screaming at passers-by about buggery and revenge. While the first two groups are arguing, a third group arrive claiming they're the rightful tenants. They paid a deposit to an elderly merchant in the local pub who happens to be the old man's business partner and representative. They claim the first group had misunderstood the old man, and his son was not to be relied upon as he had got himself involved with a group of layabouts who quit their jobs and went around all day in dressing gowns calling themselves the associates or something. In the absence of a police force to investigate and adjudicate, the students would run for the cutlery drawers, arm themselves to the teeth, and proceed to fight to the death over each room, cupboard and fucking closet. So ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Middle East, an elaborate celestial property scam for a frat house where the cutlery drawers magically refill themselves and the students' memories are unaffected by the intoxicating stupor of war. We're going to start our journey at the south end of the map in northern Israel. This is Ramat David Air Force Base, which was originally an RAF base in the 40s and built on land set aside from the nearby kibbutz. During the Arab-Israeli War in 1948, when this was still an RAF airbase, it was attacked by Spitfires from the Egyptian Air Force. Quite ironically, at this point in history, the embryonic Israeli Air Force were flying a Czech aircraft called the Avia S-199. I say ironically because the S-199 was actually a Bf-109G. I can just imagine the guy in charge of procurement reporting to his bosses, "Well, Benny, we've good news and bad news. The good news is we've got 12 of those aircraft, but no matter how many times we paint the tails, the fucking swastikas keep coming through." There's one major misconception we need to put to bed here. When this map was announced, there were comments on the forums by the cognitively challenged stating they didn't want another desert map. They may have been just trying to demonstrate that their knowledge of the world outside their trailer park was relative to the battery range of their mobility scooters, but they were wrong. Yes, there's a big fucking desert to the east, but the area is dominated by what is known as the Fertile Crescent, which has a Mediterranean climate. Israel's third largest city, Haifa, has a history stretching back through antiquity, playing host to empires and kingdoms including the Israelites, the Canaanites, the Persians, the Romans, the Byzantines, the Arabs, the Ottomans and finally the British. Its history reads like Saturday morning in your mum's appointment book, with a lot less anal penetration of course. In addition to being a major port, it's a centre for heavy industry and petrochemical production, making it a vital component of the Israeli economy. As we turn north and begin our journey along the UN Blue Line, which separates the Hula Valley in northern Israel from mountainous South Lebanon, I want you to remember one very important thing. Borders in this area are not only permeable but sometimes mobile. In this area, a border is more where you stick the fence until someone can figure out a way of getting a few tanks across it. The initial borders were decided just after the foundation of Israel, otherwise known as the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. If you want to fly historic missions here, you can fly 109s and Spitfires until 1950 and Mosquitoes all the way up to 1958. In addition to the aforementioned, the Israelis also managed to illegally procure some P-51s, which were in use right up to the mid to late 50s. It's also worth remembering that at the outset of the conflict, both sides accepted help from where they could find or purchase it. With the turn of the decade from the 40s to the 50s came the beginnings of the Cold War. Initially, both superpowers hitched their skirts at all sides, revealing their tight, juicy cooches stuffed with military hardware. However, this quickly settled into predictable Cold War patterns, with Israel being supplied by the West and their Arab foes being supplied by the Soviets. The Jordanians were an exception, being supplied initially by the British and French, and then from the 1970s onward being supplied by the US. You may incorrectly assume that the aforementioned demarcation line signified peace, but peace treaties in the Middle East are like an outbreak of chlamydia at your local gash market. No bareback for a fortnight, but plenty of gum rumbles. There was sporadic shelling of towns in the Hula Valley by Syria, and retaliatory strikes by the IAF on the Golan. Additionally, there was much fucking about from all sides over access and distribution of water from the Jordan River. The Jordan River is vital for agriculture in all three countries, and in the mid-1960s the skirmishes almost erupted into what could have been the first water war in modern times. Those with a war boner didn't have to wait long to polish their helmets. Israel had pre-established that closure of the Straits of Tiran to the south was a casus belli. Egypt promptly closed the straits to Israeli traffic. Israel then preemptively attacked Egyptian Air Force bases and positions in the Sinai Peninsula, triggering the Six-Day War of '67. In what was perhaps the biggest communication fuck-up since King Croesus of Lydia asked the oracle what his chances were of fucking Cyrus the Great in every orifice, militarily of course, both the Syrians and Jordanians, who were part of the Arab coalition, were informed of the imminent defeat of Israel. They attacked, were repelled, and Israel took the area we're flying over now, just beyond Dan on the eastern edge of the valley, the Golan Heights. Nearing the end of the Six-Day War, after heated internal debate, Israel made the decision to take and hold the Golan Heights. They had already taken the West Bank from Jordan and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, eventually holding the Gaza Strip. The echoes of these decisions still reverberate heavily in the region today. If you want to recreate all the fun and japes of the Six-Day War, you're going to need some French Dassault aircraft, along with some MiG-15s, 17s and 21s. In 1973, with their arseholes still bleeding from the previous encounter, the Egyptians and Syrians decided to return the favour on the holiday of Yom Kippur. Catching the Israelis having a post-wank snooze, the Egyptians were initially very successful, and bolstered by the Egyptian success in the Sinai, the Syrians advanced and took much of the Golan. Due to previous fuckery by the Syrians, which I will get into later, the great survivor King Hussein of Jordan wisely chose to stay out of this particular spin of the geopolitical roulette wheel. In order to stay in favour with the other Arab nations, he did send a token support force, allegedly after he made a secret agreement with the Israelis not to fuck up each other's shit. At this point I can't help but picture King Hussein as looking like the long-suffering husband of a raging Karen when the police arrive. Standing in the background, knowingly tapping his temple, rolling his eyes and shrugging at the police officers as if to say, "Yeah, she's a cunt. I'm only here because I made the mistake of shooting my load up her rancid cavernous cooch, and if I don't play along she won't let me see the gyp goblins, so please don't arrest me." Everyone in the Arab world sent a token force to assist the Syrians and Egyptians, or at least some material aid. In some cases these decisions were ideological, or at least opportunistic. And in others it was the equivalent of feigning explosive diarrhea and sending a card to avoid the wedding of a fucking insufferable acquaintance. In the air, the Syrians managed to sneak choppers loaded with commandos into the southern Golan to capture strategic Israeli command centres, so lots of action for the Mi-8, supported by MiG-19s and 21s, opposed by A-4s supporting Hueys. For a little while, with the Syrians presenting a threat of capturing the Jordan River, the Israeli Defence Minister Moshe Dayan was contemplating nuclear strikes, even though Prime Minister Golda Meir was in total disagreement. Eventually Israel recovered from the hangover and began ripping their foes several new arseholes, which they gleefully penetrated in front of the world's media, reaching to well within shelling distance of Damascus, with Israeli airstrikes becoming a monotonous regularity for the city. At this point, realising the balance was tipping, the Soviet Union, fearing loss of influence, a Mediterranean sea base at Tartus, and a major material client who was probably only a month into a hire purchase agreement, put its foot down and threatened direct involvement. At the same time in the US, President Richard Nixon, ever the prankster, was more than a little preoccupied when his pilfering japes had come to the attention of the world media. As a result, the Middle East fisticuffs was left to be handled by Henry Kissinger, who was as terrified as the Soviets at the loss of arms sales, prestige, and the mounting pressure of a US-Soviet naval standoff. Thus, all sides were pressured into a ceasefire. Below and to my left over the Sea of Galilee, you'll see the border. Is it the pre- or post-67 border? I have no fucking clue, as borders in the Middle East shift back and forth imperceptibly, like Queen Elizabeth trying to manage an itchy taint at a public engagement. With Israel's position in one of the more fertile parts of the Fertile Crescent, it was bound to be fought over like a first-degree relative at an Oklahoma gangbang. Before entering Jordan, make sure you pre-book your appointments at the local clap clinic, because you're going to be spending a lot of fucking time there. Oh, and do bring a couple of pairs of handcuffs to arrest the filthy little chavs that will inevitably tumble out of our rancid colossal cum grotto. Oh wait, my mistake, the country, not the skank. The country is fine, nice place, and certainly much more stable than the skank. Jordan began its current form as Transjordan in 1921. Tiring of identity politics and sensitive fuckers asking to feel its tits and see its dong, it changed its name to Jordan in 1949. Before that, it captured the West Bank during the Arab-Israeli War of 1948. The Air Force took a little while to get going, starting out with leftover RAF aircraft, then moving on to de Havilland Vampires, Hawker Hunters, and Vickers transport aircraft. After having their inventory wiped by Israel in 1967, in the early 70s they got their hands on some F-5s from Iran and eventually F-105s. Because to be perfectly blunt, there are devs out there who have called dibs on everything from the fucking Kitty Hawk to the Starship Enterprise, and would be far happier if the preceding aircraft were produced by ED, Heatblur, Aviodev or Magnitude 3. But let's get back to the video. In the 80s they acquired Mirage F1s. No! Oh, it was just a dream. Thank fuck it's Aviodev. They've done a magnificent job on the C-101. Guys, please do me a solid and call dibs on the Vampire, Hawker Hunter and F-105. I don't care if it takes so long my cock no longer works on release day. Just do it, please. Now, where were we? Oh yes, Jordan. So fast forwarding to the Six-Day War of 1967, unfortunately for Jordan, Egyptian President Nasser came down with a near-fatal case of optimism. Or his military commanders were telling him fucking porkies, you decide. The major challenge for Jordan was that its closest neighbour was within jizzing distance, let alone airstrike distance. The Jordanian Air Force was wiped out quickly by the Israeli Air Force, and losing the West Bank was the diet spunk to wash down the McTurd sandwich. If, like me, you're just visiting planet Earth and having difficulty figuring out how its 7 billion fucking monkeys haven't wiped each other out yet, you may be unaware that in the Middle East your friends and neighbours only have your back for as long as it takes them to spit on their palms, so they can fuck you up the arse. This was the case for Jordan. To get to what happens next, we need to jump back a little in time again. If you're still with me, and I don't blame you if you're fucking not, you may remember that Jordan took control of the West Bank in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. It officially annexed the West Bank in 1950, and all Palestinians in the West Bank were given Jordanian citizenship. This was not a popular move among other Arab governments. However, consensus was eventually reached that Jordan was just holding the area in trusteeship, similar to the way I suppose Israel holds its current settlements in trusteeship. This created a demographic shift in Jordan's western towns and cities. In 1951, Jordan's King Abdullah was murdered by a Palestinian militant at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, when rumours abounded in Palestinian circles that he intended to make peace with Israel. For the next 2 decades or so, many of the atrocities committed by all sides followed a triangular form. The Fedayeen, which is just a collective name for the many disparate Palestinian groups who often only share nationalism as part of their ideology, would attack an Israeli village or commit an act of sabotage. Jordan lacked the ability, and in some cases the resolve, to stop them. The IDF would then attack a Jordanian village, the flawed logic being that Jordan would then crack down on the Fedayeen. Many died on both sides, and most of them were civilians. In the end, Israel, Jordan and the Fedayeen's attempts to claim any moral high ground looked like 3 whores at a truck stop calling each other filthy spunk-gurgling strumpets. Okay, so there's not much flying to be done in the Six-Day War on the Jordanian side, perhaps a little taxiing, but much was evolving inside Jordan. The PLO had formed as an umbrella group for the previously mentioned multiple Fedayeen groups. The PLO had gained mass popularity among the Palestinians after providing minor assistance to Jordanian forces against Israeli forces during the Battle of Karama in 1968. Fatah, the largest faction of the PLO, cynically continued these attacks on Israeli villages throughout the latter half of the 1960s, knowing that the Jordanian villagers would pay the price. Israel cynically continued the reprisals, knowing the Jordanians were being fucked into oblivion like a cam whore with a runaway vibrator. Many Fatah and PLO groups began converging on the Jordanian cities of Amman and Irbid. They ignored Jordanian law, drove around armed to the fucking teeth like an army in occupation, and even set up protection rackets within those cities. Effectively, there was now a state within a state. The situation had become intolerable to both the Jordanians and the PLO. So the PLO resolved to establish a single state by attempting to assassinate King Hussein twice. A strategist rather than a tactician, King Hussein kept his cool. Realising that the PLO had now become the greatest threat to national security, he was under immense pressure from his army and his own people to resolve the issue. As 1970 rolled in, there were open battles between the Jordanian army and the PLO. This should not be looked upon as a Jordanian-Palestinian war, as many Palestinians had become assimilated into Jordanian society and military. The fighting was fierce, but Jordan had the advantage of a relatively modern air force, largely thanks to the IAF fucking up their last infantry in 1967. Remember that bit about your neighbours having your back while spitting on their hands? Well, the Syrian Ba'ath party, seeing an opportunity to increase their influence, sent the Syrian army into Irbid. Along with the Fedayeen, they declared it a free city. The Jordanian Air Force, in tandem with the army, repelled the incursion by the Syrians and expelled the PLO and Fedayeen from their borders. This all feeds rather neatly into the next all singing and dancing shit show that I'm about to cover. The preceding events are known as Black September in PLO circles. Since the 70s, Jordan has been very stable in comparison to its Arab neighbours. They have continued to be pragmatic in their approach to problems and have increasingly relied upon Western equipment both on land and in the air, using F-16s in the first Gulf War and the very recent battle against ISIS along the Syrian border. Where did the PLO go, Lauby, I hear you ask? Well, dear imaginary viewer, they went on a Mediterranean holiday. Drinks by the pool, young chav ladies poking themselves with Heineken bottles, pissing in the street, and the obligatory dose of chlamydia. Well, no, they went to the Mediterranean, but it was no fucking holiday. Welcome to Lebanon. Now, Lebanon is a multi-confessional, politically diverse country. Many Lebanese, being Arabs, sympathised with the plight of the Palestinians and supported the PLO. However, you may support Manchester United, but if they moved into your 3-bedroomed house, were eating your food, fingering your wife, clogging your Wi-Fi with rape porn and banging retarded glamour models on your couch, you may begin to reconsider your affinity with them. As mentioned earlier, the PLO were also a fairly religiously and politically diverse group, but in Lebanon that diversity is geographically split, and there have always been tensions between religious and political groups. For example, here in the south, the population is mainly Shia. In spite of their latent sympathies, they were less than excited to have a sudden influx of Palestinian Sunni, Christian, secularist, Democrats, nationalists, socialists, communists, and all combinations of the aforementioned, who were armed to the teeth like disgruntled fucking incels and ignored all local customs and traditions. To add to Lebanon's woes, the new arrivals, having been moved at least twice in living memory, were a little bit more militant than the average bear. There were already pre-existing problems in Lebanon. Its political system can only be described at its best as very finely balanced, so finely balanced that a louse's pube would throw it into chaos. The PLO began its previous state-building mission. This time, with a weak and divided government and military in Lebanon, they met with very little resistance, resulting in the PLO gaining control of the Shia South, West Beirut, and the refugee camps of the western coastal cities and the Bekaa Valley. The PLO in Israel also picked up from where they left off in Jordan, the only difference being that this time it was the Shia population in southern Lebanon that was bearing the brunt of their fuckery. The shark that signalled the shitstorm to come happened in early 1975. It began as a fishermen's industrial dispute in the city of Sidon, which is just off our nose here. The former mayor and head of the Fishermen's Union, Maruf Saad, politically a pan-Arabist, had intervened in a dispute and organised protests against the company which was trying to monopolise the coastal fishing industry. This company also happened to be owned by a former president. At the end of one of these protests, he was fatally wounded by a sniper, with the PLO and the local populace blaming the army. One has to ask the question who had the most to gain by his demise. Saad, as a pan-Arabist, had been an opponent of the former president and national government. but he had also been an opponent of the PLO, to whom he lost local influence and popularity. With his popularity on the rise again due to the strike, he's suddenly murdered, and immediately after his death, the PLO hijacked his cause and stage-managed his funeral. Assad's plight ignited a flame that burned throughout Lebanon, and a few weeks later a series of tit-for-tat killings in Beirut between Phalangists and PLO only served to turn that flame into an inferno. In Lebanon's civil war there were so many factions, splinter groups and constantly shifting alliances that each would need a video of their own, so for the sake of brevity I'm going to use a broad brush approach. Within Lebanon the 6 main players were broadly divided along sectarian lines. The first were the Maronite Phalangist movement, comprised mostly of Maronite Catholics who were traditionally the holders of power. They allied themselves with other nationalist and Christian groups, sometimes from the extreme right, and even in some cases they aligned themselves with Shia and Sunni groups. The next group were the secular Pan-Arabist groups. These could be either extreme left or extreme right-wing groups, sometimes including communists, Syrian Ba'a, Iraqi Ba'a, who incidentally fucking hate each other, Armenian, and sometimes Kurdish groups. These groups spent more time killing each other than I spent wanking. Sunni groups tended to be either Pan-Arabists or Islamic. These were generally aligned with and later absorbed into the PLO. Shia groups were traditionally conservative and were early adopters of Islamic ideology, particularly as a reaction to the influx of secular PLO fighters, poverty, and the low-intensity conflict that had been raging with Israel since the 60s. Later, the main Shia group Amal splintered and a new, stronger, more militant faction emerged which was backed by the new Shia regime in Iran. This faction is called the Party of God, or Hezbollah. The next major group were the PLO, who have been the thread linking the story of Jordan and Lebanon together. The arrival of the PLO was certainly a major catalyst for the civil war here, but they only needed to exploit pre-existing tensions to kick things off. The last of the larger groups are the Druze. The Druze, who traditionally had a shitty run with all the main sectarian players, historically persecuted by the Muslims and regarded with suspicion by the Maronites. This history of persecution led them to establish their own strongholds in the Shuf and Lebanese mountain regions around Beirut in central Lebanon. The Druze had no allies initially, but had sympathy for the Pan-Arabists and initially formed alliances with the PLO. But during the civil war, due to their location, they mainly came into armed conflict with the Phalangists. Okay, so far it seems like just the standard low-intensity civil war shit, just with many more sides. This murder circus is just missing its clans, but here's where it gets complex, bitter and bloody, so pay attention. On the plus side, there's some good flying to be done. By the late 70s, massacres, usually against civilians, were being committed with monotonous regularity. Trying to pick a side was akin to rifling through the scans in a gynecologist's office. No matter where one looked, there were nothing but cunts. This of course stopped neither Syria nor Israel from spitting on their shafts and going balls deep. Israel began supplying the Lebanese army and main nationalist Maronite groups with material and support. Syria's Hafez al-Assad had 2 aims: to keep Lebanon intact as a buffer against Israel, and to bring the pesky PLO back into line, meaning under his control. Syria initially allied with the Maronites and began jointly attacking the PLO. I'm not sure if you're getting the major fucking irony here, but for a little while that put Syria on the same side as Israel. Eventually there was a falling out between Syria and the Maronites, and Syria switched sides to the PLO and began picking apart the alliances of convenience between the Druze, the Pan-Arabists and the PLO. Israel continued to launch airstrikes on PLO bases and eventually invaded in 1982, taking southern Lebanon and half of Beirut. Also in 82, the US, Britain, France and Italy sent troops initially to evacuate their own civilians, but soon they established a peacekeeping presence and provided support to the Lebanese army. Even though they were a largely impartial force who had attempted to prevent attacks from all sides, due to their support of the Lebanese army, which was mainly a Maronite force, they were seen by all other groups as pro-Phalangist and pro-Israel. In April 1983, a Hezbollah-affiliated lemming blew up the US embassy in Beirut, causing massive casualties. And in October of that year, another pair of Hezbollah-affiliated lemmings struck the US Marines and French barracks in almost simultaneous attacks, resulting in extensive loss of life. This led the French Air Force to attack positions of the Iranian IRGC, otherwise known as the Basij, in the Bekaa Valley. There was also a planned Franco-US joint attack on Basij forces in Baalbek, but cooler heads in the US prevailed as Iran could not be directly linked to the attacks. After 2 years of fucking about, and let's face it, when you're a foreign force, largely ignorant of the shifting subtle complexities, and hated by more than half the population, all you can do is fuck about while trying to avoid the lemmings. The US, followed by France, Britain and Italy, withdrew. If you're flying the F-14 in this time frame, there are some carrier missions to be flown against the Druze artillery positions in the mountains, who were at the time shelling the US-held Beirut International Airport. The Civil War dragged on until 1990. It is estimated that around 150,000 people were killed. To some degree, everyone played their games here. The Iranians, the Iraqis, the Saudis, Israelis, the USSR and the Western powers. The Syrians continued to fuck around here until around 2005, when eventually the Cedar Revolution, for a change a peaceful one, drove them out. Beirut, despite being fucked harder than the rent boy at a Vatican sauna, is still a beautiful city with amazing food, bars and extremely hot women. It's still very much divided along sectarian lines, with the streets named after the various heroes to the populations that inhabit the areas. Off to my left between this highway and the coast road is the Hafez al-Assad highway, make of that what you will. The new airport highway that we're flying along now is named after Ayatollah Khomeini. Further up on the same road, just past the police station, it's named after President Nasser. It's comedically ironic that two men with such diametrically opposed visions for the Middle East are sharing the same stretch of highway in Beirut. Down here near the harbour there's a street named after JFK, and a couple of streets that retain their French colonial names. Obviously there's much fun to be had on the Israeli, American and Syrian sides during the Civil War, flying air support, or God forbid humanitarian missions. In the modern era you can take the role of the Lebanese military supporting anti-terrorist operations. When I look at the harbour area I can only imagine a 3D modeller getting shipped from his boss all summer to get the docks completed. Finally, at the very end of July, he presents his completed work to his impatient boss. Perfect in every way, he takes a few days off to celebrate. Beirut and Lebanon as a whole are the shining jewel of this map. It looks like Beirut. I know it's fucking supposed to, but it really looks like the real thing. The economic progress since the Civil War in the city centre and the comparatively wealthy eastern sector stand in contrast to the unplanned, thrown up, huddled together 2- and 3-storey buildings of the refugee camps within the poorer belts of the city. The views from the mountains are amazing, although it does take quite a heavy toll on frame rates. I suspect this will improve as the map matures, and with the new generation of cards, whenever the fuck they decide to manufacture them in any reasonable quantity, that is. However, notwithstanding, the aforementioned Beirut is still a marvel to behold. I tend to like my choppers the way I like my women, fast, easy, and with the ability to take a platoon of soldiers and maybe a machine gunner or two in the rear. Welcome to Bekaa Valley, traditionally an agricultural and wine producing area, but during the Civil War it was a hotbed for revolution. During the Civil War there wasn't much point in growing grapes for the wine traditionally produced here. Not much that was legitimate was getting out, and the only things coming in were fucking fedayeen and Syrians. As a result, cash was king, and the only choices for Bekaa farmers was to grow hashish, which could be smuggled along the same routes as the weapons. If you ever seasoned your life with Satan's Sage in the 80s or 90s, there's a good chance you had yourself some Lebanese red, and you have the good farmers of the Bekaa Valley to thank for that. Production has steadily declined since the Civil War, but if you want to be a party pooper you can always take your Huey on some anti-narco missions here, as the Lebanese military seem intent on burning the crops, followed for some unknown reason by landing on a hill downwind for an extremely abundant lunch. There's still much more to the Bekaa Valley, but before we move on to the more recent operations there is one side story that perhaps best demonstrates that in the Middle East things can go so sideways that you end up looking up your own arsehole. In the early 1970s there was a split in the PLO over Yasser Arafat's willingness to accept a more reasonable compromise with Israel. One faction leader named Sabri Khalil al-Banna broke with the PLO and took the nom de guerre Abu Nidal. His eponymous organisation was almost unique in the sense that it was usually much more dangerous to be a member than an enemy of the organisation. They concentrated their attacks on Israeli civilians, diplomats, Arab diplomats, officials and of course PLO leaders deemed too soft on Israel. New recruits were ordered to write down their life stories in minute detail. If at any point in the future they fell under suspicion, they would have to rewrite their biography. Even the smallest discrepancy would lead to torture, which often involved having one's bollocks fried in a pan of hot oil, or being buried alive with just a pipe for air and water sticking out of the ground. This wasn't helped by the fact that Abu Nidal himself was a paranoid alcoholic, usually downing a bottle of whiskey an evening. His favourite paranoia was that the Mossad or Shin Bet were infiltrating his organisation, and from his base in Syria, then Libya and later in Iraq, he would order the rounding up of members, their families and anyone else who fell under suspicion. The Abu Nidal organisation had several bases here in the Bekaa Valley and even attempted to wrestle control of one of the refugee camps from the PLO. Oh, and when it was inevitably decided that the suspect was guilty, those feeding tubes were used to administer a dose of hot fast lead to the victim. In 2002, this cocksucker received a dose of his own medicine from the Mukhabarat, more than likely on the orders of Saddam. Before we move on, I have to show you this, the ruins of Baalbek. The main building was originally a temple constructed to honour the Canaanite god Baal. The current structure is a Roman temple of Jupiter built on the same site. If you get the chance, it's well worth a visit. I'm delighted to see it so faithfully recreated in the sim, it's an amazing touch. Here in the Bekaa Valley, the greatest current concern for the Lebanese military is the overspill from Syria, with both Islamic State and Al-Nusra Front units creating bases in the mountainous border areas, which they then use to attack both the Lebanese military and Hezbollah. Just off our nose here, the village of Ras Baalbek has been attacked multiple times by Islamic State fighters in recent years, with the Islamic State fighters ultimately being repelled by villagers and the Lebanese military. Here in the north of Lebanon, there has been much to deal with over the last couple of decades. Since 2007, in Lebanon's second largest city, Tripoli, they have had to deal with elements of Fatah al-Islam and the Al-Nusra Front. Both groups being Al-Qaeda-linked cocksuckers of the Wahhabi bent, who are attempting to impose their bullshit on the Sunni and Shia inhabitants of the city and by extension destabilise the whole country. If you like choppers, the many operations here offer some low-intensity policing and air support options. For at least the next couple of decades, Lebanon has an unpredictable future ahead. A segmented population, military, police and government leave state security organs having to pull their plums during times of intercommunal or political strife. Furthermore, the most well-equipped military group in Lebanon, Hezbollah, which can best be described as a mixture of terrorist organisation and state within a state, operates freely within its borders, is backed by Iran and publicly supported by the Lebanese government. This situation led to the Lebanese military having to sit on their hands while the country was fucked from both sides during the Israeli-Hezbollah war of 2006. Many people will tell you in private that Hezbollah are a bunch of cunts, but publicly risking the ire of a terrorist group who have infiltrated most of the state institutions and are stronger than the state's army is not wise here, particularly at a time of increased pressure due to the next shit show we're going to look at. All of the preceding factors conspire against the growth of Lebanon into a stable, egalitarian and inclusive modern democracy.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Syria. The weather here is changeable today, with some showers of hot lead expected later. As you exit the terminal building, turn right when you reach the pile of severed heads and run for the APC. No, not the burned out one.
Syria wasn't always like this, so where did it begin? Syria was originally an Ottoman province which after World War I came under French control. There were several attempts by Syrian factions at establishing independence until 1946, when the French eventually said fuck this for a game of soldiers and cleared out. A republic was established, but following their defeat in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, Colonel Zaim took power in a coup. A few months later he was replaced by another colonel, and then another one. Here's a little piece of advice to the world. If you find yourself leading a destabilised democracy, ruptured republic or disastrous dictatorship, or if you're a colonel yourself who has just murdered your way into power, take every other fucker holding the rank of colonel to the local stadium, shoot them in the back of the neck and then abolish the rank. It's always a fucking colonel. There's something about the rank that makes them go from Monday morning quarterback to Tuesday morning president for life. Perhaps they just need to remove the coup d'etat chapter from the colonel training module. Perhaps the rank of colonel is just a dumping ground for Machiavellian narcissistic cunts. But either way, I wouldn't be taking any chances. Around this time in the air, Syria was using leftover World War II British stock such as Spitfires and Fiat aircraft from Italy. Fiat being an acronym for Fix It Again Tomorrow. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, we've no Fiat aircraft in DCS, but we have some Spitfires to play around with in 48. In DCS, Syria becomes interesting to us again in 1955. The Syrian Communist and Ba'ath parties had launched a coup in 54, which further destabilised the country, leading many to see Pan-Arabism as the only solution for future stability. In 55, Syria got themselves some MiG-15s, and as a direct response to British and French involvement in the Suez Crisis, Syria signed an arms treaty with the USSR in 1956. In 1958, Syria amalgamated with Egypt to form the United Arab Republic. That was brought to an end in 1961 by a free and fair election. Only joking, it was another fucking coup. There was another coup in 63, engineered by Ba'ath Party elements within the military, including Hafez al-Assad, probably a fucking colonel at the time. In 66, the military replaced the president again. At this point in the story, if Syria were a restaurant, the waiter would inquire if Sir would like some more coup with his coup. In 67, in events already covered, Syria attempted some surprise sex with Israel, only to find Israel had already laced its tea with rohypnol and was hiding behind a door with duct tape in hand and a massive erection. So if you enjoy taxiing for a few meters before spontaneously exploding or ferrying your remaining aircraft as far from Israel as you possibly can, then I can recommend the MiG-15 and 21 for this little adventure. 1970 was a momentous year. Concorde made its first Mach 2 flight, the Soviets landed a probe on Venus, the Beatles broke up, and the Egyptians completed the Aswan Dam. Meanwhile in Syria there was another fucking coup. This time it was called the Corrective Revolution, and our old friend, former Air Force pilot and future war criminal Hafez al-Assad took power. Before we move forward, it's important to note that Hafez al-Assad and many in the military were from the Alawite faith. Traditionally they were not really regarded as Muslims by the main branches of Islam, and in faith and practice they're probably closer to Christians and Jews. They were only retroactively regarded as Muslims in the 1940s by the pro-Nazi Grand Mufti of Jerusalem in the interests of Arab nationalism. Then much later they were declared Shia by fatwa from the Ayatollahs in the holy city of Qum when it became important for the Islamic Republic of Iran to spoon Syria. Although a sizable minority in Syria, they suffered from frequent persecution through the ages. After Hafez took power, he made it his business to ensure that president for life meant natural life, rather than just until the next time some colonel turned up with a manifesto and a 45. To facilitate this, he moved fellow Alawis and close family members into all the important positions of power in the government and military. This provided for generally much better times for urban Syrian Alawis, Christians and Shia, but tended to create fertile ground for Islamism within the rural Sunni majority, a majority that had traditionally held power under the Ottomans and tended to be much more conservative in their outlook. After the 1970 attempt by Syria to fuck its Arab neighbour Jordan up the arse in order to gain influence with the PLO, they provided sanctuary to some of the organisation while playing the ultimate version of "we'd love to have you stay but the in-laws are over." Thus many of the PLO went to Lebanon. In 73, in what in hindsight was the Everest of optimism, Syria then joined Egypt for yet another final decisive war against Israel. After a few days it became pretty obvious that by decisive I mean that Israel were the ones making the decisions, and as discussed earlier, Syria were the recipients of several new arseholes. That was until the Soviet Union took a look at the HB agreement and said, "Oh, just hold on a fucking minute there, guys." Surprisingly, there was a bit of a tiff with the Soviet Union in the mid-1970s, which was later patched up. In the late 1970s, there's some internal fighting to be done against an Islamist uprising directed by the Muslim Brotherhood. This was centred around Hama, which has always been a hotbed for Sunni extremism. The resulting siege and counterattack on the city led to a high, mostly civilian death toll, the most accurate casualty measurements being somewhere in the region of 20,000. Additionally, there were also reliable allegations of chemical weapons usage. When DCS? The 80s was punctuated by the Lebanon War, which brought Syrian MiG-21s and 23s into direct confrontation with Israel. There are also numerous air support operations targeting Syria's ever-changing enemies, such as the PLO, the Phalangists, the Druze and so on. Additionally, there's barrels of fun to be had with low-intensity operations until the Syrian withdrawal from Lebanon in 2005. Eventually in the late 80s, the Soviets again began supplying Syria, this time with MiG-29s and Su-24s. Around this time, they also began procuring Gazelles from Aerospatiale. It appears if you really want to know how your equipment will perform against an equally equipped enemy, all you need to do is purchase from Aerospatiale. Because those whores don't care how infected your bell end is as long as the check clears. Due to the mutual hatred between the Syrian and Iraqi Ba'ath parties, the Syrians took part in the 1991 coalition to liberate Kuwait. By the late 90s, Syria's equipment was practically obsolete by international standards, leaving them having to fillet Belarusian dictator, comb-over extraordinaire and Dr. Phil lookalike Alexander Lukashenko for spare parts. Finally, in the year 2000, the eternal leader suffered a fatal heart attack while on the phone. At least he wasn't on the shitter like Elvis. In an autocracy like Syria, with the obligatory cult of personality that surrounded old Hafez, the country was thrown into mourning. You may be surprised to learn that to appoint a worthy successor, there had to be a general election, and that election was won fairly by the old lion's son, Bashar al-Assad. It may not surprise you to learn that he was the only fucking candidate. What is really surprising is to look at this young, chinless Syrian al-Bundy lookalike. He wouldn't be your first choice of candidate to run a ruthless autocratic regime. He wasn't even his fucking dad's first choice. He was actually very much like most of you fuckers, introverted, socially awkward, with an obsessive interest in computers. I wonder if he plays DCS. Let's face it, with that chin, straps are redundant. There's no way short of staples to make a helmet stay on that noggin. This means he never got to fly fighters like Dad, so you have an introverted, socially awkward, chinless cunt with a fighter pilot itch he never got to scratch. Fits the profile, really. Perhaps the guys at ED could finally break their silence on the ID known as Bashar 1488, who keeps clogging up multiplayer comms with retarded 5G conspiracy theories about the Illuminati, vaccines, gay frogs, Zionism and the Satanic World Government. The media were very optimistic. That should be a cause for great concern, as their checklist for optimism is generally rather short. He was a surgeon, spent time in the West, British wife, soft-spoken and very amiable. This optimism was rewarded in 2001 when Syria joined the War on Terror. But this is where the first signs that the young lion was more like the old than many imagined appeared. During the War on Terror, Syria became the destination of choice if you wanted your suspect imaginatively tortured. Unfortunately, he soon fell out with the West when his financial entanglements in Iraqi oil came into conflict with the US invasion of Iraq. It has been alleged that he funded and supported insurgencies against the US, which would be comedically ironic considering the source of his current troubles. Post-2003, his star began to fall, eventually losing Lebanon after opting to use a car bomb to call for a new presidential election. Now, it would be remiss of me not to mention that car bombing is nothing new to Beirut. Since beating Belfast out of the World Championship in the 70s, they've become unassailable. Got a problem with the council? There's a car bomb for that. Neighbour parking across your drive? You've come to the right place. Guy next door keeping you awake with dubstep? Well, hey. It would be fair to say that Beirut has seen more car bombs than Jordan, the skank not the country, has had cocks in her mouth. Now I'm going to attempt to cover what this has all been leading up to, the fun part of the story, Syria's Civil War. Now I'm going to have to take a broad brush approach again here, as I want to stay as much as possible out of politics. The only thing you should take away from this is the same lesson you should have learned from the Civil War in Lebanon. Civil wars are a zero-sum game. Some groups start off with laudable aims and some groups start off as cunts. But sooner or later you'll discover yourself facing the impossible task of trying to find the side that smells the least like a fish market on a hot July afternoon. Because given enough time they all become cunts, and eventually everyone eagerly takes their turn to have a spin at the war crimes roulette wheel. For outside analysts it becomes a question of whom to advise their government to support. This is fueled by domestic public opinion, which is influenced in no small part by the media, who view their consumers as uneducated ignorami who are incapable of seeing the shades of grey that permeate our world, and instead present a black-white, good-evil dichotomy. This in turn induces governments to embark on short-term, knee-jerk reactions, which usually yield unforeseen long-term consequences. At the turn of the first decade, the Arab Spring began rolling across North Africa and the Middle East. Tunisia got away lightly, as did Algeria and Jordan, the country not the skank. For a moment it looked like Egypt was fucked, but eventually General al-Sisi, which I think is Arabic for the effeminate one, took control and cleared house. When the Arab Spring reached Syria, one didn't have to be fucking Nostradamus to predict the results. It quickly sectarianized. The media in the West got all watery-eyed when a few people yelled democracy, encouraging us to ignore an even larger group behind them raising black and green banners and yelling Wahhabi slogans, with the media telling us it was just something they did, like London blokes at a stag party shouting, "Oi, wanker!" Russia was in no mood to lose its only Mediterranean seaport. There were probably several more HP agreements, and it was a great opportunity to increase influence in the Middle East. Russia sent in advisors and air support to train and bolster the Syrian army and loyalist militias. The problem for Russia begins in a lapse of strategic judgment not seen since Soviet times. Russia contracted much of the fighting on the ground to a PMC which they thought was firmly under their control, Wagner Group. On paper this may look great, provides operational deniability, no aircraft full of servicemen returning in wooden overcoats draped in the national flag, no need to worry about the inevitable political fallout when relatives and comrades of fallen servicemen vocally question why they're dying so far from home, and no need to set aside funds for the often unspoken cost of war, physical and psychological rehabilitation. It's almost a free ride, just the cost of entry, right? Well, no. You see, dear viewer, PMC is the politically correct name for what we used to call mercenaries. Mercenaries were generally held in great disdain by professional armies and soldiers, because at the end of the day, mercenaries are whores in search of cash and adventure. Now don't get me wrong, dear viewer, I hold whores in very high esteem. For example, your mother is a fine lady who could suck the engine out of a Ferrari's tailpipe, but whores have their place, and the modern battlefield is not that place. Most governments, at least those with any foresight, use mercenaries to protect installations and VIPs. Less enlightened governments use them as death squads. Russia instead used them to prosecute the war, with full support from the Russian Air Force and full use of Russian military transports and Russian military medical facilities. This is a dream gig for a mercenary, excellent private sector pay, along with the air support and medical facilities normally reserved for professional state armies. The issues arise because mercenary groups are headed by businessmen, often with investors and boards to please. No country is immune from this type of underpants gnome defence economics. The West allowed mercenary companies such as G4S, Aegis and Blackwater poke their avarice snouts into seemingly bottomless defence troughs, with sometimes severe blowback. Hopefully they've now learned their lesson regarding not allowing these fuckwits slip their leash again. The problems for Russia began in earnest in February 2018, when the Wagner Group decided to mount an attack on a Kurdish position, either not knowing or not caring that US servicemen were embedded with the Kurds. The US servicemen called in support in the form of F-15s, F-22s, Apache helicopters and artillery, and after 4 hours between 200 and 600 mercenaries lay dead or wounded. To say the Kremlin were pissed off is an understatement of the same magnitude as saying munching down on Chiroptera is not recommended. You see, dear viewer, there was major fuckery afoot. The head of Wagner Group, who is known as the chef because of his long-standing involvement in the restaurant business, had made a little deal with some businessmen in Damascus to take control of the area that contained oil facilities both he and the Damascus businessmen had shares in. As you can probably guess, the Kremlin had no fucking clue this was about to happen. And there, dear viewer, is the major reason why one shouldn't use whores to fight wars. The only chain of command for a mercenary group is the one willing to provide the most lucrative deal. Additionally, you can kiss goodbye to secrecy. There are no such things as Official Secrets Acts or DoD gag orders that bind regular military personnel. When their contract ends, the average contractor goes from up to 10k a month to zero. At this point, they will happily blabber to the first person they meet with a wad of cash and press credentials, like a scorned footballer's wife who has just caught her husband ejaculating in the pool boy. As a result, the Wagner Group have been relegated to protecting installations from pilfering locals, while two new companies, Shield and Patriot, now prosecute Russian battles. I think the preceding sordid tale of fuckery should be of great interest to mission designers. It is the most realistic avenue for a potential flashpoint leading to direct state-on-state confrontation. Moving on, it's well known that Turkey never had any love for Syria. Additionally, they saw an opportunity to prevent their oldest fear, Kurdistan, from coming into being. I'll cover more of Turkey's involvement later, but let's just say in the beginning they were happy to assist Wahhabi fighters of varying shades of extremism along with their equipment cross the border into Syria. Remember, my enemy's enemy is the regional maxim. Speaking of the regional maxim, who would be the most unlikely pair one could imagine to catch sucking each other's dicks during this little shit show? Well, it's no secret that Israel and the Assad regime were not on the best of terms. It was discovered that al-Nusra Front fighters, yes, those Wahhabi al-Qaeda affiliated cocksuckers I mentioned earlier, were crossing over the border into Israel for medical treatment and were receiving medical supplies from the Israeli army. No one checked the boxes, but I do have my doubts on the medicinal properties of 7.62 rifle rounds, unless of course one is faced with an infestation of anti-vaxxers. Personally, I would rather find one of the boxes of cash allegedly used to pay off al-Nusra Front commanders. Israel claims that it was medical supplies for civilians, and of course it doesn't discriminate when it comes to humanitarian aid. For Israel, it's as simple, if just as short-sighted as some of the Western decisions. Their main enemies are Syria and Iran. If that means short-term support for a bunch of murderous cocksuckers, then so be it. I should also at this point mention that the only doctrinal difference between al-Nusra Front and the Islamic State is that they believe al-Zahiri should be running the show from his ISI safe house in Pakistan, rather than the late and unfortunately often missed Caliph al-Baghdadi. I should further mention that there is reliable evidence that the Syrian government, the Islamic State and the al-Nusra Front have been fucking about indiscriminately with chemical weapons. The latter two bands of cum-guzzlers capturing their supplies from the former when they overran the Sheikh Suleiman 111th Regiment Army Base northwest of Aleppo on the map here in December 2012. What puts Al-Qaeda, the West, Russia, Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, the PLO and Hamas on the same side? That would be the Islamic State. They burst onto the scene like a premature ejaculation at a fellatio contest and surprised everyone by covering the faces of a large portion of Iraq and Syria with their rancid goo. Perhaps the only contrast between them and some of their enemies was that while equally fuck-witted groups like the al-Nusra Front denied their atrocities, Islamic State were proudly videoing broadcasting their atrocities like the Paul brothers or your average Twitch streamer whoring for attention. Although, to be perfectly fair, the beheadings, slave markets and constant prayer were sublimely more palatable than some entitled fuckwit screeching about being stream-sniped. All were in agreement that something had to be done about ISIS, and if you want the widest range of modern aircraft and targets, then the Syrian Civil War is going to pump up your pecker. You can fly F-16s for Israel attacking Syrian targets. You can fly F-16s for Jordan attacking ISIS. You can fly for Russia in the Ka-50, Su-25T, Su-33, supporting mercenaries, private military contractors, and Syrian forces attacking the rebels. Kurdish YPG, Islamic State, the Syrian secular opposition, Christian opposition, the al-Nusra Front, and nearly everyone fucking else. You can fly F-16s for Turkey and attack the YPG, the Syrian armed forces, and the odd Russian jet if you run out of Kurdish targets. You can fly as the West attacking Islamic State positions in support of the Kurds. Even though for a while in 2017 it appeared as though the US were going to say, "Thanks Afram, great job, best of luck out here," and look set to abandon their most reliable ally in the Middle East. Thankfully this hasn't happened yet, so there's still much fun to be had flying missions on the US side. You can fly as the Syrians in Mi-8s, Gazelles, Mi-24s, MiG-21s, 29s and L-39s, attacking everyone except the Russians, Iran, Hezbollah and the West. That's what makes Syria such an interesting battlefield. There are so many competing sets of rules of engagement that it's sometimes as confusing as knowing whose side you're on. You can't be the good guy here, you can be the naive guy, the bad guy, the pragmatic guy, or the really bad guy. The only thoroughly bad guy that can be agreed upon by all is the Islamic State, and fuck those cunts. This is the conflict on the map that keeps giving and giving. Syria is the area where a good mission maker can challenge not only the player's skill, but their decision-making ability. There are military targets next to civilian targets, there are civilians taking shelter in the same apartment blocks, schools, mosques and churches that the fighters are targeting you from. If you want to eliminate your enemies, you had better get used to the idea of collateral damage. And unless you're curious about the latest torture trending among the fundamentalist fuckwits, don't bail out. Although to be fair, those sick fucks have yet to dream up an atrocity worse than TikTok. There are so many groups ostensibly on the same side who hate each other just as much as they hate their common enemy, resulting in war crimes being a daily feature. Making rules of engagement is very easy for the Syrian government and most of the militias, while increasingly difficult for outside actors, with difficulty generally scaling in proportion to the level of democracy, press and political freedom in their home countries. In summing up, perhaps the greatest issue for Bashar al-Assad is one, to my knowledge, that I have not seen touched on in any discussions. For all intents and purposes, he is now, like Lukashenko in Belarus, Japarov in Kyrgyzstan or Tokayev in Kazakhstan, a vassal of Russia. His executive authority will be dependent on the overall regional strategies of the Kremlin, who may not want a quick end to the war, as the longer the clock runs, the more our chinless friend will owe to his patrons. So the future for Syria is about as optimistic as the average DCS player's hopes of getting poontang. There are at least 6 wars taking place here that are somewhat separate from the Civil War. This creates a very big problem for mission makers, which I will get into towards the end of the video. Cyprus, the Surtsey of this map, which I was going to avoid, but as it recently rose from the sea, now I have to record this section and try to slot it in 8 months after finishing the rest of the audio, so fuck you guys. Cyprus has a rich and ancient history, but really only becomes important to us in DCS after independence. Independent Cyprus suffered from the same malaise as Lebanon. There were pre-existing ethno-religious tensions, and to solve this, quotas were put in place, so the president had to be a Greek, the vice president a Turk, and ethnic quotas were put in place for the parliament. The results here were the same as in all places where loyalty is based on ethnicity, or which member of the pantheon one yells into the void at. The minority begin to feel fucked over, and the majority begin to feel they have given too much in return for too little. In reality, both sides are right and wrong. If a country isn't democratically governed on principles and policies, and the people when voting for candidates are not willing to disregard everything except those principles and policies, then that country is pretty much fucked from the beginning. Ethnic tensions only worsened as the 60s wore on. The respective populations became balkanized with all the associated massacres. The president was under pressure from Athens to unify with Greece, and later became the target of terrorists backed by the junta in Athens. By the late 60s, Greece was under the rule of a brutal nationalist military dictatorship. They decided to solve their Cyprus unification problem with a coup on the island and replace the exiled president they failed to murder with a rabid anti-Turk wanker. Turkey demanded the removal of the aforementioned wanker, equal rights for Cypriot Turks, along with the integration of Cypriot Turks into the security apparatus to protect its population. The junta said no, and Turkey invaded. In a surprising turn of events, Turkey actually did the people of Greece a huge favour. You see, dear viewer, the only reason the junta back in Athens were able to hold on to power was due to their claim that they were uniquely positioned to defeat Turkey. When that claim was proven as wide and hollow as the gap between Jordan's legs, once again the skank not the country, the Greek people said fuck this and forced them out. There were peace talks and a second Turkish invasion which very nearly brought Turkey and the UK into conflict. There were atrocities committed by both sides which rivaled and perhaps even foreshadowed the vicious depravity of the 90s Balkan Wars. Just off our nose there you will see the resort town of Ayia Napa. You will never find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy. Going back to the Turkish invasions for a moment, in the air we're talking F-104s, F-4s, F-5s, yay we have one of them, and maybe a few Hueys or even one or two Mi-8s on the Turkish side, facing off against F-104s, F-5s, F-84s, and maybe even some Mirage F-1s on the Greek side. Tensions are still high here. You have two NATO members waving their cocks at each other across a UN peace line. This could be a venue for future flashpoints, particularly with an increasingly autocratic regime in Turkey, which may need to distract its populace from problems at home. It's a beautiful island both in reality and in DCS, and don't forget there are 2 Royal Air Force bases and some UN policing, and potential future fuckery of course. Of course, compared to the fun to be had in Syria and Lebanon, it pales into almost insignificance. Additionally, it's a great place to go on the piss with squaddies, particularly if you enjoy the superiority of being the only guy wearing clothes in the bar after a couple of drinks. The future is bleak for this beautiful island. With the advent of streaming in the last decade or so, the arse has fallen out of the most valuable component of both the Greek and Turkish Cypriot economies, the pirate DVD and music market. So, we'll move on to Turkey. Turkey is a land of contradictions, and trying to unravel those contradictions here would be on a difficulty scale akin to asking your mum to take a break from gumming sailors' shafts. Before I begin in earnest, the cities of Adana, Iskenderun and Mersin look magnificent from the air. The surrounding countryside and of course the Taurus Mountains are a credit to the makers of this map. It's very difficult to know where to start with Turkey, as using anything other than the broadest of brushes would send one hurtling down a never-ending series of rabbit holes. In order to frame the modern history, it's important to remember that in another time and as another entity, Turkey ruled this part of the world in its entirety as the Ottoman Empire. This was more than just an empire. The Ottoman Sultan was also the Caliph of the Faithful, the de facto spiritual leader of the Sunni Islamic world. This all ended in 1923 with the foundation of the Republic of Turkey by a man who saw the potential for a secular, forward-looking nation. His name was Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. He quickly abolished the caliphate in 1924, severing Turkey's ties with the Arab world. This caused some testicular torsion with the Kurds, whose identity at that point was as confessional as ethnic. Ataturk rightly saw that Turkey needed a highly educated, scientifically literate population. The empire of the past, the caliphate, the Sharia, and political religiosity were chains that had to be broken. He was an inspiration to later leaders of the Arab world to undertake various social and political experiments with modernity, but so far he has been unique in his success. Perhaps one of the few flaws, and by far the most long-lasting in the new republic, was the establishment of a very dogmatic vision of Turkishness. More on that later. An important facet of the new republic was the establishment of the military as guardians of the constitution. Over the decades, the military stepped in several times, but always immediately restored civilian power, after a few adjustments, of course. It was only during the third coup in 1980 that the military, in a short-sighted bid to defeat another already dying form of religious extremism, communism, began to portray Ataturk's secular legacy by reaching out to religion, usually the last refuge of a government who have burned their bridges with everybody else. Now for the fun part, war. Turkey has a long history of military aviation, including the world's first female combat pilot, who was Ataturk's adopted daughter, Sabiha Gökçen. She completed over 8,000 hours in many aircraft and took part in many combat missions. Ironically, she may have been a survivor of one of the darker events before Ataturk rose to power, the Armenian genocide, which is still a very tense subject in Turkey, so much so that saying this in Turkey is about as healthy as licking the pavement in Wuhan. It earned the journalist who uncovered this a sudden and fatal case of sudden cranial lead poisoning in 2007. In the late 1940s, the Turkish Air Force used an inventory that included FW-190s, Spitfires, P-47s and Mosquitoes, but their operations were limited to internal policing against bandits in the east and border security in the northeast against the Soviets. Turkey joined NATO in 1952 and possessed the second largest NATO military after the US. Before we approach the modern era, please bear in mind that it seems to be the habit of new states to inherit the enmities of their forebearers. The 20th century Turkish Republic and the Ottoman Empire couldn't be more diametrically opposed. The Sultanate was an expansive empire, whereas the Republic was neutral and sought to build its economic power from within its own borders. Notwithstanding the aforementioned, the new Republic and indeed the new Soviet Union viewed each other with hostile suspicion, which has in part contributed towards the current hostilities with Russia. Due to intercommunal violence in both Greece and Turkey during the Turkish War of Independence, then in the 50s pogroms against Greeks directed by an inept and struggling Islamist Prime Minister Adnan Menderes, which was further fueled by later events in Cyprus, Turkey's relationship with Greece, a fellow NATO member, has been about as cordial as the plot of a fucking Tom and Jerry cartoon. Turkey's relationship with Syria began to take a downturn even before Syria came into existence. The southeastern province of Hatay, which is now Turkey's southeastern border with Syria, was declared a republic after World War I. In the late 1930s, they voted to become a province of Turkey. It was a referendum, will of the people, democracy, right? Well, the Syrians see it differently, as it appears the Turks may have been up to some fuckery. Prior to the referendum, Hatay's largest city, Iskenderun, suddenly allegedly gained a lot more Turks. Additionally, the Turkish army allegedly arrived and advised the Alawite Arabs and Armenian Christians, who were the majority in the city at the time, to fuck off over the border into Syria. All of the previous inherited enmities continuously hounded Turkey in the late 20th century, the present, and will probably continue to do so far into the future. As a member of NATO, the Turkish Air Force took part in almost all of NATO's operations, but not on this map, so instead we'll jump forward a little in time to just after the invasion of Cyprus. Our next conflict began as an internal policing issue which has now morphed into several international disputes. Let me be very clear here, neither side is blameless. Those who seek to deny either PKK terrorism or Turkish military atrocities are either lying fuckheads or brainwashed ignorant gobshites, who should be patted on the back, reassured that everything is fine and walked away from as quickly as possible, in the same way one would deal with rounding a corner and coming face to face with a naked lunatic wearing a polka dot bow on his cock. To provide the briefest of backgrounds, in order to forestall perceived internal divisions, the Turkish Republic developed a dogmatic homogenous identity, which largely excluded the many smaller distinct groups who made up the population of Turkey. Imagine, if you will, a modern US government punishing Navajo for speaking their language so they can fuck idiots out of their money at casinos, Texans for wearing big fucking stupid hats and referring to their parents by infantile names, Alabamans for fucking their sisters, or Kentuckians for the oral abomination that is country music. I say let's get those musical re-education camps opened without delay. Well, that's kind of how it played out for any group seeking to keep any tradition which was considered to deviate from the government's strict definition of a Turk. In the late 1960s, there had been far-left student unrest across Europe, which quickly spread to Turkey. The PKK, a Marxist group which had developed from a few of the many Kurdish protest organisations, had by 1978 morphed into a terrorist group. The usual fuckwitted patterns of such groups were observed, targeting police, the military, civilians, dissenters within their own community, and eventually resorting to suicide bombing. They not only became a target of the government, but also the neo-fascist Islamist Grey Wolves, founded by a fucking colonel no less, who with gay abandon attacked all they suspected of being Kurds, Alevis, Greeks, Armenians, Christians, Jews, and once even tried to assassinate a Polish man in a frock. Being retarded skinhead types, they beat, raped, murdered indiscriminately, and in recent times their retardation reached what is hopefully its pinnacle, when they attacked a group of South Korean tourists, mistaking them for Chinese in an attempt to settle scores for Uyghur mistreatment. The sad part is, despite being designated almost universally a terrorist organisation, using the heroin and illegal arms trade to fund their operations and under security service surveillance wherever they choose to infest, to this day they retain the tacit, if not explicit, backing of the Turkish government. This was part of a greater cycle of violence between the extreme left and extreme right in Turkey. A common thread of both extremes is their inability to tolerate the existence of any variance from their perceived ideals of uniformity or homogeneity, be it thought, confessional or ethnic. Eventually, in 1980, both sides realised that violence was futile, and over a refreshing glass of apple tea decided to reconcile for the future of Turkey. Just kidding, there was a fucking coup, of course. The army kicked the fuck out of everyone, and this time they continued doing so a lot longer than they should have, casting a net so wide that many innocent people were disappeared. This had the effect of making the military, who had previously been seen as saviours of the nation, about as popular as a minstrel show at a BLM protest. The economy tanked, newspapers were forcibly closed, and there were firings in the judiciary, individually symptoms of a state on the precipice of autocracy, combined almost certainly a terminal prognosis. Eventually the military reached out to the Islamists, and the foundations of the paths to the present were laid. In the meantime, the PKK largely buggered off to Lebanon and Syria. Now remember the whole Hatay province referendum shenanigans from the 30s, yes? Well, so did the fucking Syrians. The Syrians armed and provided training to the guerrilla wing of the PKK. They also aided them crossing the border into Hatay and other Turkish border provinces. The comical part about this was, due to the Marxist bent of the PKK, the Turks were convinced the Soviets and later the Russians were the ones behind the infiltrations. And as a result, the army and the MIT, Turkish Secret Service, directed most of their anti-insurgency resources to the Soviet and then Russian borders. It is important to remember that not all Kurds support the PKK. There are Kurdish groups for every point in the political spectrum, from lunatics seeking to return to the Iron Age to secular Democrats. Here's just another little kicker about how twisted shit can get in the Middle East. Remember when covering Lebanon I mentioned the Iran-backed Shia terrorist group Party of God, or Hezbollah? Well, there's a Kurdish/Turkish Hezbollah, not fundamentalist Shia like their namesake, but fundamentalist Sunni, and backed by Iran. You couldn't make this shit up, but these fuckers obviously have. A decade or more ago it wasn't, and I suspect still isn't uncommon to go to bed in a sleepy southern Turkish town, and to wake up the next morning to hear swarms of choppers overhead, no mobile or internet signal, machine gun positions on every roundabout, and the streets bookended with nervous-looking conscripts yet to sprout hair in their balls, armed with poorly maintained assault rifles and even poorer trigger discipline. To the casual inquirer it was always just a drill, until a fucking bus spontaneously exploded. Then it was just an isolated incident. So if your thing is low-intensity anti-insurgency border policing, grab your Turkish Huey and welcome to Hatay. If you prefer fighter jock action, you can always wander into Greek airspace around Cyprus. Airspace bordering hostile nations is bizarre. It reminds me of the one window licker whom I suspect has existed in every generation of every primary school throughout history. Remember him, the tard who stood in place windmilling his fists, telling people it was their fault if they walked into them? Well, that kind of reminds me of the airspace around these countries. With the development of the Syrian Civil War, Turkey has taken the opportunity to settle some scores with their three oldest enemies, the Kurds, Syria and Russia. specifically in that order. If you fancy some ground pounding, you can always attack Kurdish positions in northern Syria, or Islamic State positions if you can't find any PKK or YPG ones. Due to the looser rules of engagement here for the Turkish Air Force, you can engage Syrian military air traffic, and even Russian air traffic if you can catch them close enough to the edge of Syrian airspace to claim that they were in your airspace. You can also fly in support of the Syrian National Army, mainly comprised of ethnic Turkmen, and moderate Islamic groups like Jaish al-Ahrar, Al-Sham Legion, and Ahrar al-Sham. Look them up. Unfortunately for the people of Syria, the Syrian National Army is practically a mercenary group paid from Ankara, bankrolled from Qatar, whose primary goal is to keep the YPG-dominated Syrian Democratic Forces east of the Euphrates, increase Turkish influence and impose fundamentalist principles. Fighting the Islamic State and stabilising Syria come far behind on their wish list. The YPG and Syrian Democratic Forces have their own issues, chief among them being that at a command level it's hard to know whether one is looking at a list of PKK or YPG commanders. Even taking all the aforementioned into account, the Kurdish forces have been the only dependable ally the West has in the region. By attacking the Syrian Democratic Forces, Turkey has placed itself in opposition to its NATO allies in what has become an increasingly antagonistic relationship which is no longer beneficial to the rest of NATO. In 2015, a Turkish F-16 shot down a Russian Su-24. This brought issues with Russia to a head. Then in 2016 there was the failed coup, after which quite a few pilots and maintainers were fired from the Air Force, with a few more dragged off into detention somewhere. This has weakened Turkey's strike capabilities considerably, in particular F-16 squadrons. Eventually Turkey and Russia made an agreement not to fuck up each other's shit. Turkey has purchased the Russian S-400 air defence system, creating what should be an untenable position within NATO, and shitting on their chances of acquiring new materiel from Uncle Sam. The new alliance with Russia is rather batshit. The fun part is watching to see who gets fucked first by whom. Erdogan may fancy his chances as a wily autocrat, but he's following the playbook written by the man he thinks he's going to outfox. Vladimir wrote the fucking book, so my money's on him. Additionally, while pretending to be besties, both are fighting proxy wars not only in Syria but also in Libya, the latter war where disconcertingly it has been alleged that man-out-of-the-loop autonomous weapons are being tested. Furthermore, Turkey is paying and providing air support to its mercenaries who are engaged in a war with Russia's only true friend in the region, Syria. Anyone who thinks that Russia is just taking this on the chin needs to get back around the fucking campfire for another verse of Kumbaya. My view for the near future in this area is cautiously pessimistic, as I think the chapter in the current establishment has yet to come to its bloody and dramatic conclusion. This, I believe, will be facilitated by a rather amateurish hand played when the parliamentary system was recently replaced with the presidential system, thus installing himself as de facto president. Whereas before the many disgruntled Turks could blame 600 parliamentarians for all their woes, now they only have one president to blame. I sincerely hope things will improve, as the Turks and Kurds deserve a hell of a lot better than what they've got so far. But when unyielding nationalism is blended with regal narcissism, things generally only go one way. There is a silver lining though. Lots more real-world scenarios are coming soon, and the well is fucking deep. The map is wonderfully executed, and it's now pretty much finished. This is the map that gives and gives when it comes to air combat from the mid-late 20th century, early 21st, 22nd, 23rd, 24th, 25th, 26th, 27th. It has every kind of war, low intensity, military coup, transnational, international and global conflicts. When I looked at the channel map, I said it was the best World War II map for DCS. Well, Syria is the best modern map for DCS. Well done, guys. However, before you break your necks trying to fillet yourselves, I do see a small problem, or rather a large set of problems. Coalitions. Currently, DCS is designed for menage a trois. Not even that, it's set up for dogging, with two groups going balls deep while the third stands on the sideline wanking like chimps. The problem is, Syria is a fucking orgy. We need way more coalitions. By way of example, in the south, Benny will shoot at Hassan and Ali, but he'll give Abdullah a wave, a bucket of cash and medical supplies. Benny won't shoot at Hassan's friend Dima, or Hassan and Ali's enemy Koban. Meanwhile, Hassan may shoot at everyone except Ali and Dima, while Dima shoots at everyone except Ali, Sam, Mehmet and Tom. Tom and Sam generally focus on Abdullah's retarded cousin Shahid while avoiding Dima. Mehmet usually targets Koban while taking pot shots at Hassan, Ali and the odd fucking sneaky slap at Dima. He avoids Tom, Sam, Shahid and Abdullah. You see where I'm going here. Syria is a one-stop, every hole's a goal, no cock left behind shit show where the jizz and blood are already at neck level, and the next stop is Prolap Central. We need more coalitions, a more complex way of setting relationships between those coalitions, and more rules of engagement for this map to reach its full potential. I'm delighted to see they've fixed the frame rate issues around Beirut, Damascus and the other cities from Syria to Israel. What I can still piss and moan about, however, are the macro stutters. They occur for no apparent reason, particularly repeatable ones around Adana, Cyprus and the Taurus Mountains. But I'm very optimistic these will be resolved in due course. I mentioned earlier in the video that the cities are amazing, and they are. But please remember that DCS doesn't go down the Microsoft route of designing every house, dog kennel and clapped out washing machine on the lawn. They use what can be best described as a flavour approach, meaning the design and aesthetics of the cities are captured, and from my memories of the cities I have been to in the past, the flavour in this map is intense. The plane set is immense, from the Spitfire 109, 190, P-51, P-47, the upcoming Mosquito, the F-86, the F-5, F-14, F-15, F-16, F-18, the MiG-15, 19, 21, 23, 25, 29, the L-39, the Su-25, the C-101 and the Mirage. On the chopper side, the Huey, the upcoming Cobra, the Gazelle, Mi-24, Mi-8, Ka-50. For chopper jockeys, this map is without parallel in DCS. I recorded this video a long time ago, but then shit got in the way before release. When I returned, the magnificent 2.7 had been released, but I decided to leave the introduction as it was. I think the comparison is startling, and just in case anyone forgets how beautiful... Forget I said that. My intention when covering this map was to steer clear of politics, but with a history like this one can't avoid the background events and underlying causes. I have endeavoured to remain as impartial as possible by looking at the history as if I had just arrived from another planet. A wise man once told me that if at some point everyone doesn't take offence, then you haven't covered the history, and yes, offence is always taken, so kindly go suck a bag of dicks. Additionally, politicians and newsmen in every country tend to view the Middle East like there's a magic solution that will set everything to the most favourable outcome, of course depending on their political viewpoint. The big problem is that everyone engages in short-term tactical thinking to solve long-term problems that have their roots in short-term solutions applied over the last 2 centuries. It's easy to be deterministic about the Middle East. Right now we see bearded fuckheads larping a long dead past, sending gullible young men to their deaths, opaque, veiled, silent, frightened women in fear of their male relatives who have placed power in the hands of those bearded fuckheads, and children doomed to repeat the loop. If you visit the Middle East or make friends there, ask to see some old family photos. You may be surprised to learn that you could be looking at your own family's old photos of a trip to the beach, a drink-fueled party or a holiday. Until the 80s it wasn't like this, and it doesn't have to be like this in the future. In answer to the Reagan question, would the opposing factions in the Middle East assist each other in the event of an attack from aliens who saw bipedal, relatively hairless apes as a delicacy? Not a fucking chance. I fear all sides would immediately rush to rank their enemies according to succulence in order to be the last on the dinner plate. In these parts, being seen to adhere to long-standing enmities and immutable beliefs are much more important than arriving at a logical conclusion, and I suspect even survival itself. Maybe at some point in a faraway time to come, the Israelis, Palestinians, Syrians, Kurds, Turks, Lebanese, Cypriots, Greeks and Jordanians will forget their petty squabbles and gather in the garden of peace as one human family, sucking freshly squeezed orange juice from the cocks of leprechauns while riding around on unicorns. And on that hopeful note, I thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to dislike or tell me to go fuck myself below.